Have you ever been sitting in a theater, or maybe a concert hall, and just felt absolutely captivated? You know that feeling, right? Where the rest of the world literally just fades away, and you're entirely absorbed in the performance happening right in front of you. But what actually makes a live performance feel that immersive? Well, welcome to this explainer. Today, we're going to peek behind the curtain to look at the secret mechanics of theatrical magic. We're exploring how master creators across completely different centuries have manipulated physical space to basically hack our senses. Here's our roadmap for the explainer. We'll cover the immersive stage, dive into the Mannheim sound revolution and orchestral dynamics, then pivot to visual stage design, Johann Engel's use of the mirror, and finally wrap up with the lasting legacy of sensory design. Let's get into it.
Section 1. The immersive stage.
You see, true immersion, it's never an accident. It doesn't just magically happen because the story's good or the performers are super talented. No, it is carefully, meticulously engineered behind the scenes. Creators are deliberately manipulating our physical space, I mean the exact sound waves hitting our eardrums and the specific light entering our eyes, to directly control our psychological and emotional state. It's wild when you think about it.
Which brings us to Section 2. The Mannheim sound revolution.
Let's rewind a bit to 1720. Elector Charles III Philip moved his court to Mannheim, Germany, and he brought this massive orchestra with him. But the real magic, the actual turning point, started when a visionary composer named Johann Stamitz was hired in 1741. By 1750, he became the director, and under his guidance, this orchestra grew into an absolute powerhouse that heavily influenced the whole classical music period. The impact was so huge that by the 1770s, their influence was flourishing all the way in the concert halls of Paris.
The sheer discipline and individual virtuoso skill of these musicians was so off the charts that the English music historian Charles Burney famously called them an army of generals. And honestly, he wasn't exaggerating. They didn't just play together, they breathed together. And because they were that locked in, they could pull off these crazy technical feats that other orchestras simply couldn't touch.
And that insane discipline led to their most famous innovation, the Mannheim crescendo. To put this in perspective, before this, back in the Baroque era, dynamics were mostly flat or stepped. You played quietly and then boom, you played loudly. But the Mannheim Orchestra developed a way for the entire ensemble to smoothly and powerfully swell in volume together. It was this sudden, roaring wave of sound that fundamentally changed how audiences physically experienced music. It was thrilling, it was visceral, and, for sure, it was entirely new.
Section 3. Engineering orchestral dynamics.
So how did they actually engineer this groundbreaking auditory immersion? Well, they used 5 signature techniques. First up is the rocket. Think of a rapidly ascending, broken chord that shoots from the lowest bass up to the highest soprano. Fun fact, Mozart actually used this exact technique to kick off his Symphony No. 40. Then you've got the roller, which is this extended crescendo rising over a repeating bass line. Next is the sigh, a really dramatic descending pair of slurred notes that finally help them ditch the rigid basso continuo of the past. They also threw in the birds to mimic chirping during solo passages. And finally, my absolute favorite, the grand pause. This is where the entire orchestra just stops. You get a moment of total, gripping silence before they vigorously start up again. These weren't just musical notes, they were literal psychological triggers.
And this builds a really fascinating bridge for us. Because just as the Mannheim school manipulated sound, using those independent winds and dynamic crescendos to create a physical and psychological effect, modern set designers manipulate physical space to do the exact same thing. Both are just different forms of sensory engineering.
Moving on to Section 4, Designing the Visual Stage.
Now, we're grounding this visual exploration in some rigorous academic research. This is drawing from a dissertation out of the University of Pretoria by Christian Harris, which meticulously examines the work of the pioneering South African set and costume designer Johann Engels. Engels was an absolute force in shaping the theater scene back in 1985 and beyond, and this research gives us an amazing direct window right into his creative process. To really get Engels, we have to understand the philosophy he was working under for a specific production. It centers around this concept called Gesamtkunstwerk. It's a German term coined by the legendary composer Richard Wagner, and it basically translates to a total work of art. Wagner believed theater shouldn't just be one thing. It should unite music, visual design, poetry, and movement into one seamless, overwhelming experience. So Engels was tasked with bringing Wagner's ultimate vision to life. He had to figure out how to translate massive, abstract philosophical concepts into actual physical reality on a stage. No small feat.
Section 5. Engels and the mirror.
You see, Engels wasn't just building a set. He was building a philosophy. Wagner was deeply inspired by the philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer, specifically his work The World as Will and Idea. On top of that, Engels wanted to physically represent Jacques Lacan's psychological theories of reflection on stage. He needed to make the unconscious minds of the central lovers, Tristan and Isolde, visible to the audience. He had to build a world that wasn't just a physical location, but a literal psychological state of being.
To pull this off, Engels used an incredibly complex staging setup. Archival records show he brought in dynamic light projections, he used actual laser beams to create a literal, glowing psychological prison for the lovers, and most importantly, he utilized highly innovative mirrors. This was a technique he developed after studying European designers like Josef Svoboda.
The absolute crown jewel of this design was a hidden downstage mirror. Just picture this for a second, a massive, tilted mirror built right into the floor of the ship's set. As the performance happens, this mirror vividly reflects the cosmic space above and around the actors. It visually destabilizes the floor, pulling your eyes deep into this reflected unconscious realm. It physically plunges the viewer into the exact same disorienting, emotional space that the characters are trapped inside. It's just brilliant.
And finally, Section 6, Legacies of Sensory Design.
Bringing it all together, whether it's through the sudden physical force of a rising orchestral arpeggio hitting your ears in 18th century Mannheim, or the stark, disorienting reflection of a tilted mirror hitting your eyes in a 1985 South African theater, the ultimate goal of stagecraft remains exactly the same. It's all about sensory engineering. It's about bypassing the logical brain and plunging the audience directly into an emotional truth.
So the next time you sit down to watch a performance, whether it's a symphony, a play, or an opera, I want you to ask yourself, are you just watching a story unfold, or are you actually experiencing a carefully engineered sensory revolution? Really pay attention to the light, the silence, the swell of the strings, and the reflections on the stage. You might just experience the whole thing with completely transformed eyes and ears. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep exploring.